Alrighty. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the DSci Labs community call, week of June 20th, 2022. We are recording these calls for future discussion, and for anyone who can't make it to this allotted time slot, we'll be posting these on YouTube. So if you look at the info section of the welcome, at the info channel of the welcome category, you'll see the YouTube playlist link posted. I've also posted it in the general channel of community. That one will likely kind of fade away as discussion continues to happen, but there is a permanent spot for it in the info channel. The general structure for today, we're going to start off with a couple announcements and a recap of everything that happened last week. Then we'll be jumping into deeper discussion on peer review, which our very own Dr. Philip Collier is going to be leading for us today. So with that being said, Ian, are you in a place where you can actually speak?
Yes, I can.
Would you mind giving us just a quick view of the incredible weekly recap that you put together?
Yes, absolutely. So it kind of starts from the community call last Monday, and overviewing the General Index Hackathon that is being hosted by the DSci Labs team, and with a little bit of background as to what the General Index actually is, like this collection of 107 million papers stored as keywords extracted from the manuscript. And I also posted a little repository that I've been working on as like a framework for work with a testing data set for anyone that's maybe interested but doesn't know where to start when working with this type of data. And then I dug a little bit deeper into the conversations that were had. So Chris brought up a number of very interesting use cases for the general index in the context of decentralized science. One example is linking the different content similarities between manuscripts, and sort of like building like a network of similarities between different published papers and the potential use cases that has as we move towards like decentralizing the publication process for scientific literature. We talked quite at length about large language models and GPT-3 and DALL-E 2 and the use cases that these incredibly powerful transformative AI technologies have in the publication process, and how this can really bring it in to the modern age and away from these static PDFs and towards more living documents. And then I talked a little bit more about some of the different conversations that we're having throughout the week. So Eric, you brought up an interesting point of data structure, which is like how to maintain consistency and reproducibility of these very large data sets that comprise, 38 terabytes or even more. How do you make sure that how do you handle version control of something like that? And you brought up that you can actually just the entire data set, and that hash will be unique to the data set. And if even a single thing is changed, that hash will change dramatically. And that if you attach that hash to a timestamp, you can manage the version control of different models and different tests that are ran on anything that is built on these very large data sets, which is absolutely essential for these large language models as they build and get more and more complex. And then finally, I did a brief recap of Chris's journal club, talking about decentralized societies and soulbound tokens at Protocol Labs journal club, which was a very fascinating conversation, and just the potential that these non-transferable soulbound tokens have to really extends the capabilities of blockchain in creating these meaningful, lasting communities, and building relationships on a community level that can that are not prone to Sybil attacks or any other transferable type of relationships, and really like building up people's reputation in these communities. And I also included links to a number of readings below that were mentioned, a few GPT-3 use cases that already exist. One of the really interesting ones is the illicit research assistant, which I'd never heard of before, but basically uses GPT-3 as like a semi-automated research assistant to help anyone, in their literature review searches, and is definitely something that I'm going to be using going forward. It's quite incredible what it can do even at this stage. But that's about everything from last week, which was a very, very interesting week of conversations.
So as always, thank you, Ian. You're the real MVP here. There are a ton of people in the community who can't necessarily take the time to keep up on Discord, still want to be involved in the conversation. what you're doing, putting together these weekly updates is so important to so many people. It's appreciated by everyone on this call and quite a few people who can't be. So with that being said, we'll skip on to actually we'll skip on to a couple of the things to be on the lookout for this next week. Carla, who, because of bad Wi-Fi, cannot be on the call today, is putting together a couple different things for the community. So one of them being a reputation board for all of the people who are consistently talking, consistently working on the general index, helping the team out with tasks, alpha testing, whatever it may be. We want to make sure that we track those contributions and that we have a good view as to the people who are actually contributing to the community itself. So be on the lookout for that one coming sometime in the near future. Then we're also going to have a more robust proposal submission pipeline coming out in the near future. That's another one that, thank you to Carla, she's working on. So keep an eye out for both of those things. And then I can quickly pass it off to Chris, who's on the call, to maybe talk a little bit more about the release of nodes in alpha that should be coming soon. Chris, would you mind just saying a little bit there?
Yeah, of course. Thank you everyone for being here. So we will begin to send out invitations to test out the alpha versions of DeSci nodes. So the alpha versions essentially, so the plan is to have a programmatic release scheduled through the summer and to essentially increase the amounts and formats of objects that these DeSci nodes can store in IPFS. So it's going to start with documents, that means PDF documents, and also code from GitHub. And as we will go through the summer, we'll have support for video, for various different other types of formats that you will be able to upload into these research objects and store them into the IPLD data model that will be put on IPFS. So what's the functionalities that will be for this alpha versions? So we are essentially testing the UI UX. We are testing the ability to upload PDFs, to upload metadata using the DOI system and Crossref. We are testing the ability to connect code via annotations into these documents. So these are some of the main features that we will be testing. I could say that there is mobile support, but it is still rather there's some work to do on the mobile side. So we will probably have, I would say, 5 to 10 people from the community that will take on to alpha test the system and start and essentially just increase the number of people we'll be sending invitations to. So we're really excited about throwing this out to you guys, and I'm very much looking forward to all the feedback that you will be sending to us.
And thank you to everyone. Quite a few people on this call have actually already signed up to be alpha testers, and definitely appreciate the community members here who are continuing to be active and are signing up, but definitely gets preference for some of the first people who are selected. So expect that to be coming in the very near future. And with that, I think we're probably good on updates. John, do you want to share your quick anecdote before we jump into peer review?
Sure, it's kind of also related to peer review.
Okay.
So I've been trying to explain how blockchains can revolutionize the way science has been done. And I've been trying to explain this to older people who have been in the system for a very long time. And I've been doing this for like 10 years at this point. And it's always very, very difficult to explain it because there's no example. There's no real tangible thing you can be like, this is what I'm talking about, right? So you're trying to explain the economics of blockchains and all this fun stuff that the technology can do. But and this is why I'm very excited about DeSci nodes and what this product actually does, is I was speaking with one of these people who I've tried to explain this before very recently, and I was able to explain the evolution from a PDF to a research object, and using a solid example that I could show them, like this is what it might look like, and they were receptive to it. Like they're like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, there's a lot of different information that comes with research, not just a PDF. Sure, a digital object makes sense. And once that door opened, all of a sudden I was able to explain like, well, peer review can also be changed. We can make it more reliable, and we can make research more replicable. And they immediately clicked like, oh yeah, didn't they just, like, some big publishing house rescind like 13 publications because it turned out they were wrong or something like that? And it's just so useful to have a tangible object that you can share with someone who might be hesitant with regards to cryptocurrency and blockchains. So for anyone who has maybe had these discussions with people before, who have worked through the legacy system, I would highly recommend you take the demo video or anything to do with research objects and the nodes software and show it to these hesitant people, and just go from there. I'm pretty sure it will open the door for you.
That is awesome to hear, man. Really awesome. Yeah, we're super excited. I think when you start making things palpable for people with an interface, this is where perception changes. So absolutely. So I'm super excited. I love hearing these types of anecdotes, and I'm really looking forward to pushing the message out there and relying on all of you to essentially, preach the words of how we can create a more transparent scientific record and a more reliable mechanisms of scientific validations.
So, John, it's funny that you mentioned that. First off, I've had that exact same experience. I don't even try and explain to people what I'm doing anymore. I give them like a one-sentence TLDR and just say, watch the video.
Right.
And they'll come back and say, oh, this is what you meant. And it's incredible. Whenever we release the product in alpha, we'll also be releasing channels along with it. And one of those channels is called Success Stories. We want to be documenting all of these incredible stories as we continue to move forward, because it is fantastic content and source material for us to use as a larger group and as a scientific community. So thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. With that being said, I think that's it for the updates. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Philip Collier to start talking about peer review.
Thanks so much, Eric, and thanks everybody for being here. This is really, really cool. I'm so excited to see this community come together. So maybe just to add to what we were just talking about, I had a similar experience a couple of days ago when I was talking to the folks that are in charge of the library at the Free University in Amsterdam, where I'm working, and they were really interested in what we're building. And the moment when it really clicked for them was when I showed them the nodes demo, and they were super excited about it. And basically so all of that made perfect sense to them. They actually have a person at the university who is specifically in charge of encouraging the faculty members to engage in open science practices. And basically their main comment was, how can we as a library use this? How can we support you? How is this going to work for us? And this was just a really, really cool turn of the conversation that I really enjoyed quite a lot. So I'm really curious if we're going to get similar reactions from other universities, but this is really cool. Okay, so to switch gears and to talk a little bit about peer review, I thought it's maybe a nice idea for us to share with you guys a little bit how we're currently thinking about the infrastructure for peer review that we're planning to build. And let me just try to share my screen here with you. Let's see if nope, this is actually my video. Okay.
And for anyone who is listening on the YouTube call, I'll be trying my best to link some of the PowerPoint slides that Phil is sharing so that you can also see them.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, so in the system that we're building, the peer review would happen in the ARCs, the autonomous research communities. And so the ARCs are basically going to be a modular DAO stack that we're going to set up, which is going to have a bunch of options for different communities to actually configure the review process and everything that has to do with it according to their needs. So the idea here is that different scientific communities, they probably have different approaches to how they usually do that. they may want to actually set this up in slightly different ways. They may also have different models in mind, how they actually want to incentivize and review and reward their reviewers, and so on and so forth. So so it's going to be a modular stack with a bunch of options that the respective community can then basically through governance choose what exactly they're going to do. And each of these arcs is going to have a treasury that they're going to be completely in charge of. In that treasury, there is going to be a variety of possible income streams that they could use to generate revenue. So one of them would be a potential initial endowment that they may get from the DeSci Foundation. Another one may be through a hardware tax on wings in the Library of Knowledge, where the most outstanding research objects that they have reviewed and selected would be featured and displayed and illustrated with a beautiful piece of art. Then there would be validation grants that people or organizations could post to get specific nodes reviewed or also replicated. And then there may also be a case to be made that some ARCs may actually choose to have submission fees similar to what the American Economic Association is doing. So I'm not sure if you guys are aware of that model, but it's so their flagship journal, so the American Economic Review, for example, what they do is that each author who submits a paper, they pay $200, and in case the article does not get printed in the journal, they basically get $100 back. And that generates a revenue mechanism for them that they can use to pay their referees. I think they pay about $200 for referees that submit their reviews on time. So something along those lines may also be something that we can support with our system. And in our ARCs, there's going to be 3 different roles that people can play. So there's obviously going to be the authors. We call them explorers in our system, the referees, which we call wardens, and the editors, which we call keepers. And there may be a specific promotion track, how people can actually advance from being an author or a community contributor to become a referee. And eventually, there may also be a voting mechanism that people may be promoted from warden to keeper. And then within these arcs, there's basically 3 different rooms where decisions are being made. So we're thinking about the first room being the ARC gate, where a node would be submitted. And there would be a first screening by the wardens or the keepers of that ARC, whether the node actually fits into the topic of the ARC and whether it smells and looks like science and something that the community, the ARC community, would actually want to work on in detail and to review it in more depth. If that is not the case, then the node is just not going to get an in-depth review. But if the community thinks that it is suitable, then it is moved forward into the ARC chamber, where the referees or the wardens would then do an in-depth review, and a handling keeper or editor would be selected. And then there could be a mechanism where either in line with what journals are currently doing, the editor or the keeper is inviting specific referees to do the work, or it could also be in a self-selected manner where all the ARC members basically just see in the dashboard what is currently up for review, and they can contribute a review for something that is currently in the chamber. And these in-depth reviews, they could also be assisted by community annotations in the notes. And then the next step would be also quite similar to how this is currently being done in journals. The keepers or the editors would then look at the reviews and they would make a decision about whether the work is actually critically flawed. That would be the only case where we wouldn't mint an impact certificate. But otherwise, we would mint an impact certificate, and the really outstanding work may also be featured and illustrated with a piece of art. And these really outstanding pieces could then be displayed in the library of knowledge. So that's the basic mechanism. And each ARC would have governance functions and possibilities to measure to manage their treasury. And in terms of governance, they could modify the ARC configuration. So I will show you in a second what some of the options may be. They can also modify the promotion track of people within that ARC. And there's also going to be an option to actually elect keepers. So that's the basic setup. And when we then go into the actual review process, we can track the contributions that the ARC members are making at the various stages. So at the gate, at the chamber, and at the end, with a ARC-specific token. And these ARC-specific tokens, they would basically be attached to the individual that is working the ARC. So it may be something like the soulbound tokens that we discussed last week, which basically verify the identity of the individual and that track the qualifications of that person, and then also track their contributions in terms of, for example, engaging in votes at the gate, or actually contributing a review, or also for the work that the keepers are doing at the end. So all of these things can be tracked, and based on the contributions that people made, they can be rewarded by the ARC, and there may be at least two different mechanisms. There may also be a possibility to combine these two things. So one would be a stipend, where the ARC members, the wardens, would basically get a monthly stipend from the ARC. And the second one would be a reward per contribution, something like the American Economic Review is doing, where the referees are getting a specific amount of money for each review that they're doing. And in terms of configurations, there are a number of things that we can play around with, and that the specific community can then decide how they want to set up their ARC. So, for example, there could be a choice between whether the wardens are going to be pseudonymous, or whether they will reveal their real identity. There could be a choice about how the reviewers are being selected, so whether this is going to be basically bottom-up, where the community is just engaging in the things that are posted on the dashboard, or where the editor is specifically sending out invitations for referees. There can also be choices about reviewer accountability, how annotations are being handled. There can be choices about how votes in the ARC are going to be made, so both in terms of governance, but also in terms of how specific articles or notes are being evaluated, and whether these votes are going to be transparent or messy. So we have all these various things that the ARC can then select, and we're thinking about a really easy to use system where they can basically just click a switch, and then they basically can configure the ARC in a way that suits their needs. And so then the big question in terms of peer review quality is, of course, so how do we actually make sure that the reviews that are being submitted there are actually useful? And I think there is a number of criteria or quality dimensions that we can look at. So from my point of view, a peer review needs to be quick, it needs to be constructive, it needs to be objective, and it needs to be competent. So the first of these things, so the timeline, this is easy to quantify, obviously, and we can reward it explicitly. The other three things, constructive, objective, and competent, are a little bit more difficult. In general, I think that the reviewer status will probably have to be earned in these arcs. So this is how I'm thinking about it. So this is basically with ARC members that are actually being in the role of wardens or referees. They could be selected based on their CV. They could be selected based on recommendations of other ARC members, or they could be promoted into the role of an actual reviewer or warden in the ARC based on community contributions that they're making. And then there may be a system where authors and or editors could rate these reviews. So this could be a very simple rating system, such as a thumbs up or thumbs down, or it could be on a Likert scale, something along those lines. And then the reviewers could be reviewed in greater depth at specific intervals. So for example, one way how we could do that is that the reviewers at the lower and the higher end of the perceived quality distribution could then be evaluated in greater depth by the editors or the keepers of an ARC. And this could happen, for example, annually. And there could be explicit rewards for people that are just doing really outstanding work, where basically the keepers agree that this particular person or these people have actually done really outstanding work, and they could be rewarded with Reviewer of the Year award, or they could get higher monetary rewards, or a combination of these two. And reviewers that are consistently making bad reviews, they may get a warning, they may get lower or no rewards, and they may receive fewer invitations for reviews in the future. So this is in general the setup that we're thinking about. So I'm going to stop it here and just open it up for discussion. I'm curious what you guys think.
You guys can use the text chat, the stage chat if you want. I have questions to fill in the space in the meantime. Regarding the, you're also welcome to unmute and join through voice, of course. The actual how ARCs operate in sort of a fundamental level. I'm curious if anyone can make an ARC, and also when it comes to getting a publication reviewed by an ARC, can any ARC choose any piece to review, or does the author have to submit their publication to a specific ARC?
Yeah, these are great questions. So I think in general, our system is going to be open for any community of scientists to set up an ARC. So they will have the tools available to do that. And then we may have a governance mechanism at the foundation level where basically the Foundation Council, which we'll talk about at some later point, I think, will make a decision about whether a particular group of scientists, whether they would get the official status of an ARC that participates in our economic ecosystem, which would mean that they have the possibility to gain revenues, for example, through the Library of Knowledge. So there could be something like a very simple application mechanism where people just say, okay, so here is the ARC that we want to set up. Here's the topic that we want to cover. Here are the people that are going to be involved at the beginning. And then the council could make a decision about whether they would actually give that ARC permissions to participate in the economics of the system, and whether and how much initial financial endowments we would give these ARCs. So that's how we're thinking about that. And in terms of submissions, I do think that there's probably a lot of good reasons for having a system where basically anybody can submit their work or their note to an ARC to get peer reviewed. So the primary incentive here for the authors would be that they, so there's several dimensions that would give authors an incentive to do that. So one of them is that if their work is being positively evaluated, they would get reputation. They would also get an impact certificate, which may at some point in the future actually give the authors of the node the possibility to gain financial rewards for the work that they have created. And it may also help the authors of the work to get badge certifications and reviews that are publicly available, which may actually help them to get published in vanilla journals, right? So this is sort of like a pre-publication feature of our system where authors can actually get feedback from the scientific community, and they can get certain open science practices verified. So they could get verified, for example, that they have their data and their code available, and that their research object is self-reproducible. And all of these things, they would help editors of traditional journals to make decisions about whether they would accept that work for publication, and it would give the editors of traditional journals also information that they would otherwise not have. And they may actually, for the editors, it may be a very nice thing that they can already see what the scientific community is saying about that particular piece of work, and then they can decide whether they want to invite additional reviewers to have a look at that article. And they may also be able to make more targeted decisions about which type of referees they would still need at that point. So yeah, so I think submissions are probably a good way to go. An alternative system would be that the ARCs are basically just looking through the entire database of nodes, and they try to identify nodes that fit their research theme. I'm curious how you guys think about it. For me, a submission system would actually be probably more efficient.
I think submissions.
So yeah,
Go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
Yeah, so just to add a bit, so there was some really interesting questions here. So first of all, I'll preface that we're very early in the way we're thinking about these arcs. Most of our focus is really on creating this base layer around these nodes. I want to also dig into a little bit more about what was said earlier about, can anyone set up an arc? So the answer is yes. It is permissionless. Now, that said, if the ARC would be approved by the DeSci Foundation, there are additional benefits that would come with that, like initial funding and like a stamp of approval, which would be essentially a marker of quality. So this is how we're thinking about it, to maintain a balance between both a permissionless system and a system that signals legitimacy and scientific competence, which is especially important at the start, where all of these communities essentially do not yet have established reputation. So that's the way we're thinking about it. To elaborate a little bit on the systems for selecting nodes and how the ARCs would go about it. So we have this, essentially anyone can add a validation grant on a piece of research. These ARCs can then select which validation grants and first of all assigned to them and which one they are interested in picking up. And I think it's very important here also to mention that these are grants. These are not service agreements. So essentially there are no strings attached. Hey, can you make this piece of knowledge more robust, more replicable? Can these attributes be verified? And that brings us to perhaps one of the most important part of a more holistic scientific validation system is that right now, verifying attributes is a universal pain point. So by attributes of a research paper, I mean things like, have you posted your code? Does it work? Are your artifacts reproducible? All of these things right now, there's no real workflow that has been established aside from two associations. One of them is the American Economic Review, which does reproducibility verification. And the other one is the SIGINT from the ACM conference and a couple of other ACM venues. The Open Science Foundation issues badges, but there's no structure or workflow to verify them. And badges can be extended to things like, is your data fair? Does it follow the FAIR principles? FAIR principles meaning findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And essentially, the way DeSci sees the future of scientific validation is a system of scientific validation which is more holistic, which considers the entirety of the research object and not simply the manuscript. And that means we need ways to reward also and incentivize scientists to get these attributes certified. So so I hope these are useful clarifications. I also want to quickly share my screen to show you something as well. Let me see if I can do that. Share my screen. Yeah, go live. Is this working? Yeah, okay. So, yeah, great. So I want to highlight a couple of trends. So there's a number of trends. One of them is that open access is winning. That means that the major publishers are shifting towards open access in different ways. And that is having consequences, drastic consequences on the type of models of peer reviews that are being selected. So typically models that require professional editors which have high rejection rates, like the Nature family of journals, for example. These business models in which the winner pays for everyone else are typically not going to be sustainable in the future. And we will have a shift towards more and more mega journals that evaluate uniquely only the soundness of work. So it's important to keep that in mind as we try to predict what the future landscape of scientific publishing will look like. Open peer reviews on an ascending path. There was, data many years ago. There was journals attempting these experiments for posting your peer review reports online, and these experiments initially were met with a lot of resistance. And this is starting to change, and I think there's been quite a lot of surveys of researchers and attitudes around sharing and signing your peer review reports have substantially evolved over time. And moreover, there's a general dissatisfaction with the credit system in academia when it comes to peer review. So reviewers want credit for their work, and this is something that is becoming more and more important, especially since we are having an absolute floodgates of scientific papers, and finding reviewers is an ever-increasing challenge for editors. Another big trend is a push for more reproducible science, and that goes back to what I explained earlier about the badges, about reproducibility verification, FAIR principles. All of these things are essentially the next battle of funders. So funders worldwide are now investing in infrastructures. They're issuing RFPs, creating metrics for evaluating compliance with the FAIR principles. They're trying their best to essentially increase the scope of scientific validation to address matters of data sharing, reproducibility, and all of these things. And this brings us to perhaps, the way that we see these things at DeSci Labs evolving is we tend to think of publications as having attributes. So that means it's not, you are published in X, you are published in Y. You could imagine that being published in a journal is essentially one of the many possible attributes that your research can have. And you can have other attributes. You can have typically, badges proving you've shared your code, you've shared your data, that your results are reproducible. You can have foundation-specific badges, right? You can have scientific philanthropic groups that issue their own badges that have their own benefits for the researchers. You can have decentralized societies like SCURFs, like others, who can also issue their own markers of what their communities values and what they're willing to reward people for. So I think this general idea of so tightly coupling a given research object with a set of attributes which have been validated, of which peer review is only one of the many possible attributes, is the direction that we need to go to create a more robust and replicable scientific record.
That's fantastic. Thank you. That answers so many questions. With regards to the question, Philip, that you asked earlier, the in my mind, it seems like if anyone can make an arc, and I want to spin up an arc that gets to the level that one day it gets the DeSci Foundation stamp of approval, right? I'm gonna need resources to mine. Essentially, I'm gonna need nodes that I can demonstrate my arc's capabilities on. And if it's a submission-only system, who's going to submit to an arc that's just starting? They're essentially no-name citizen scientists who who are still probably very good, but just have no reputation behind them. Well, if it's a sort of open playing field of nodes as resources, that arc can go in and just like pick nodes, and like they're not getting rewards for doing this, but they're just demonstrating their capabilities by doing some peer review and maybe some other work with each node. So to me, an open playing field of resources seems like it might help the arc ecosystem grow a little better.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, so this is one of the essential things we've been thinking about is like, I like the phrase, proof is in the pudding. And when you set up an arc, you can actually, you will have your identities tied to other nodes you might have produced in the past, right? So there will be essentially a way for your community to say, this is the standard that we strive for, and have a couple of exemplary nodes that your community stands behind, and use that as essentially a way to establish a standard and to communicate to the world that this is the level of rigor, this is the level of intellectual work that you can expect from that community when it comes to not only scientific validation, but also the type of domains in which they have high competence for producing knowledge. And we want to make those as we will have interfaces for people to discover and to be able to promote their arts in their communities.
Yeah. So I think that's a fantastic discussion, and I totally agree with what was being said. Let me just add two ideas that we had to get this ARC system started at the beginning. So one of them is about the reputation of the ARCs, and I think that is actually a really, really crucial point. And ideally, what we're striving for is that the first ARCs, that they're going to be set up by leading researchers in their respective fields. And at the beginning, this will probably take quite a lot of work from our side to identify people that are leaders in a particular community and to get them excited about the idea of setting up an ARC, and to also put enough money and rewards on the table for these people to actually get involved. And if he succeed with that, then it would basically be a system where the best of the best in each specific field are then sending out invitations to others in their field to start creating nodes and to submit it to these ARCs. And we can add a specific incentive for people to actually submit their nodes to an ARC for evaluation. And a super easy way to do that would be to have a best node award, right? So you could imagine that an ARC gets started and they may have one or several rewards that people can compete for. And the winner of these rewards may then get a specific prize. So let's say $11,800, which would allow them to then publish their work in a traditional Nature's journal under the open access agreement that they offer, or something along those lines. So something that gives the authors and the scientists a specific incentive, both in terms of monetary reward and in terms of reputation.
Awesome. This is so interesting.
I think these are phenomenal answers to John's questions. John, hopefully that answered everything that you're asking. I see we have quite a few different folks on the call from other organizations thinking about peer review. We've got Scurf, we've got Talent Owl, we've got Darren, who might have some additional questions. Renee, I see you posted one in the chat. Would you mind just reading it for everyone on YouTube?
Yeah, sure, happy to. Hey, everybody. Really cool stuff. Always excited to see what the team's working on. So here's my devil's advocate question. It reads, so Talent DAO is basically an ARC before ARC was a thing. We have our own way of thinking about peer review. We're platform agnostic. What's the value proposition for existing research communities to move to a opinionated framework such as this? There are so many people saying, use my platform to build your DAO, and I tend to just hesitate to lock my DAO into any single opinionated framework. The only thing that matters to me is that the platform is EVM compatible. TLDR, does this platform aspire to be a panacea for everything, like a Aragon platform for DeSci? And also, is there a distinction between an ARC and a DAO that does science? Are all ARCs DAOs?
These are great questions.
Question.
You want to go for this, Chris?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I think we want to create as many independent layers in the stack we're building as possible. So it should be possible for communities to essentially plug and play different components of the DeSci ecosystem we're building. So I think interoperability is key. And if a community builds a particular layer, and I know you guys have been building something quite incredible, and I want all of this to be interoperable. Right? And I do not want to be pushing, a specific solution to communities that have been building their own systems. What I want to do is give these communities the best possible affordances to be able to use the bits and pieces that they do not have necessarily built. Right? So that's really the way we're seeing it. It's really we want to create a box of Legos for people to play, to build, and to create interoperability.
Yeah, exactly. And another purpose of the DAO stack that we're creating is also to just give a really easy user experience and the possibility for scientists that are currently not involved with the Web3 system yet to join that system and to basically benefit from all the advantages that doing peer review in Web3 may have. So it's also an infrastructure for just really onboarding the scientific community at large. So not only the leaders that are already in the Web3 sphere, but really the global scientific community.
Renee, does that answer your question?
It definitely, I think, addresses my concerns and answers part of my question. So the other second half of my question is, what is the distinction between an ARC and a DAO as we currently understand it? For example, like you could argue that the network health study that has been developed out of Talent DAO, they're funded, they could arguably spin off as their own ARC. So I'm just wondering, like, what's the unit of analysis? How should I be thinking about ARCs? And is building a DAO outside the scope of an ARC, or is an ARC a DAO?
Yeah, so I'll happy to chime in on this. So we think of ARCs essentially as scientific validation communities. So that is the let's say the bread and butter. There's of course a much wider range of things you can do with a science DAO. I mean, you can do funding, you can essentially conduct research as part of a group. There's many different things you can do. So we see it essentially as a validation layer on top of DeSci nodes that allows scientists to recapture the value they create by curating science. That is the very focused mission of the ARC. So you could imagine a scientific community having an ARC as let's say, a module of its greater DAO ecosystem that could be essentially focused on different aspects of research, right? So in that sense, it's only a subcomponent of a much wider knowledge creation economy.
Yeah, exactly. And so we're also thinking that the ARCs, they would be basically in a legal wrapper that would make each of them independent. And a suitable legal wrapper for such an ARC would be a Swiss association. So that would be very easy to set up. And it would give each ARC legal autonomy and protect its members legally. So in that sense, so they would really be independent legal entities that just operate in this ecosystem.
Got it. Very, very helpful. So in theory, like, do you see, like, would TalentDAO have multiple arcs within it, or would it structure itself as one arc within this platform?
That's a
So,
good question.
I think, yeah, it's a great question. So it really depends on the field of activity of TalentDAO. So, for example, let's imagine TalentDAO does both DAO sociology and perhaps DAO agent-based modeling, right? Two rather independent field that can lead to they're basically looking at two different parts of the elephant, right? This is human network organizations and how this all works. So in that case, you would have non-overlapping specialists and communities. In that case, you could have two different arcs. I think, though, in most cases, in the majority of cases, it would be one arc. That's how we see it. And you could imagine arcs that are specialized either on specific research questions. You could also imagine arcs that are specialized on specific thematics like longevity, crypto economics, or even more specialized fields. So yeah, that's how we're seeing it right now.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. That really helps.
And I think, another point that's very important that we haven't brought up here is peer review user experience. And that's something that's has been woefully neglected by the workflow innovation platforms in science. There's plenty of workflow platforms in science, SaaS businesses, all sorts of things. But when it comes to the user experience of peer review, the user experience of scientific validation at large, this has been a neglected topic, and we want to essentially empower communities, scientific communities, to have better UX, to conduct more efficient peer review, and conduct more holistic validation of the research objects that are pushed on this ledger of science.
I really like that emphasis on holistic review. As I've been digging into some of the literature around peer review in the last few weeks, I've noticed this increasing trend of just like it being really hard to measure the effectiveness of peer review because there's no sort of like ground truth on whether or not a paper is of sufficient scientific quality, and that the subjectiveness of the reviewers themselves plays such a big role. My question is for these arcs, as they're sort of doing this peer review, one, I love the fact that they'll be like looking into replicability more, the openness of the data, the openness of the code. And in terms of how to lower the subjectiveness of peer review, I wonder if you'll be looking into like increasing the amount of reviewers on a paper from like 2 or 3 to a greater number to sort of just reduce the amount of subjective bias, almost like a part of like a greater amount of maybe like crowdsourcing or just more experts looking at papers. And /sure if that's something that's going to be left to the individual arc. And then one second question I have is, would papers or authors submit their studies to multiple arcs in hopes of approval, or just focus on one specific community?
Do you want to take this one, Philip, or should I go ahead?
Go ahead, I can chime in later.
Yeah. So the emphasis. So yeah, the problem. So peer review requires 3 conditions, right? It requires finding competent reviewers, requires expanding effort, and it requires telling the truth, often with blunt honesty. And it's very, very difficult to find to essentially have optimized for these 3 quantities to maximize the quality of the peer review report. Often this is why editors are used and play such an important role, is that they are essentially the ultimate ensemble learners at the end of this process, which are weighing the different opinions of the peer reviewers. And that requires a lot of wisdom and a lot of expertise to do that. Now, I definitely agree that more reviews is generally better, but there's also diminishing return And there's also a case for managing your human resources in a way that is sustainable at scale. Now, that said, there's also a good case to be made that a study that is incredibly, let's say, controversial or novel, or is essentially reporting on an anomaly that really questions like a dominant or important theory should gather more pairs of eyes. So I think we have to think about peer review and managing human resources very, very carefully when we consider the number of peer reviewers that we can essentially task on a given paper. That said, I do not believe that the current model, the egalitarian model, meaning every paper should be reviewed by X number of reviewers, is the optimal. I don't really have an answer on is there a principal way to do this in the future. But it's definitely something that I welcome further conversations with all of you guys about that. Concerning authors submitting to different arcs, I think, yes, so you can in principle. Think about the fact that when you think from first principle, does it make sense that papers are only reviewed once? No, clearly not. Papers that were published 20 years ago in many fields, they wouldn't even make the cut today for methodological reason, right? Today they would be considered hopelessly statistically flawed. Nonetheless, the knowledge that has been brought about by these statistically or methodologically flawed papers still essentially are driving discourse. You have that in dietetic studies and in medicine and many different fields of science, where you have essentially a survival of very influential studies that would never make the cut today. The question is, well, shouldn't we have the ability to verify them a second time? And I think there's good arguments to be made that yes, if they have wide and strong societal consequences, we should be able to elicit verification an arbitrary number of time.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you're actually raising a really, really crucial question, which is basically how should we organize peer review in a way that we really optimize its quality? And I think this is pretty much an open question. So I think a lot of us probably have our own views on this. There's a lot of parameters that we could play around with. So the number of referees, also the types of things that the referees would evaluate, how they would evaluate them, how much weight these various factors are ultimately given. All of these things, they matter. And the truth is that we know really little about what empirically works best. So what is really the optimal model of doing peer review? And is there even one optimal model that works for all fields? And so we're actually thinking about setting up a research program in the DeSci Foundation, where we will have researchers literally doing research on that specific topic, helping us to identify how such systems should be designed in an optimal manner. So this is definitely something where I think we need to learn a lot more. But ultimately, what our system allows the communities to do is to just play around it. It gives a playing field where the different communities can basically establish their own approach to things, and where we can collect empirical evidence on what works and what doesn't.
And I think we have two folks on the call, Umar and Nick, who are actually working on peer review experimentation at the moment. Would one of y'all mind just giving a quick overview of what SCURF is doing with that?
That would be cool.
Yeah, definitely. And I do have to hop soon, just because speaking of that project, we actually have a 1 p.m. call on it. But just to give like a quick overview, what we're trying to do is identify how open peer review could work and how it can be optimized for quality. So what we're trying to do is basically establish a series of experiments in which we try different types of peer review, play around with different variables and parameters. For example, one of the parameters we're most interested in is the role of anonymity, how either signing your review or not signing your review would affect the quality of your review. Another one we're really interested in is incentive. Does financial incentive actually create a reason for reviewers to give more reviews and motivate them? There's been some interesting studies that show perhaps the best reviews happen without that financial incentive, because it gives the reviewer sort of a non-materialistic reason to be cooperative. And so what we're trying to do right now is just create a very simple, basic open peer review MVP, where we run some Web3 researchers through a public peer review on the Smart Contract Research Forum, pay our reviewers, and see what happens. Do these reviewers give quality reviews? Are they affected by having to do it in public? And how motivated do they feel by the financial incentive at play? And then in future experiments, we'll hopefully be trying some different financial incentive mechanisms, such as maybe some reward curves based on the timing of the review, or allowing some collaboration between reviewers, and really just seeing what is the model of peer review that works best. Because I think, to Philip's point, like we don't really know yet, and part of that is because peer review, as we know it today, and heard from Darren just a couple of weeks ago on a Scurf community call, is so new, that like it's been really shaped in just the last 50 years since the Cold War, when it became increasingly a way to hold scientists accountable for the way they were allocating funding. And so like that to me was a surprise to hear, because I thought peer review had been around for so long. And yet it's this, like, the formalization of peer review is something that is new to the system, and I wonder how much of that formalization is needed. And so hopefully that's just something we'll be playing around with, is like, how do you identify quality peer review? How do you identify quality science? And how does making it public and making it financially incentivized affect it?
Yeah, this
That
is
is really cool.
fantastic that you guys are doing these experiments. This is exactly what is needed at this moment. So we really need to get like solid empirical evidence on what actually makes peer review work and what doesn't. What are the parameters that really matter? And I'm just so glad that Scurf is leading these efforts, and we're more than happy and really enthusiastic about supporting these efforts.
I think there's a lot of room for collaboration.
And also, if you want to learn more about the surprising history of peer review, I believe, so Darren, who is with us today, did a really great talk at Scurf, and I believe they do share these videos, and you can find that online and learn all about the fact that peer review is a post-Cold War, essentially has been established itself after the Cold War, and it's a fascinating history.
Yeah, thanks, Chris and Umar, for mentioning that. We'd love to chat more about sort of the history of peer review if anyone's interested. I was also going to ask a quick question in terms of the way that DeSci Labs is thinking about how to evaluate the reviews. I remember on the slide, I think there was something mentioned about how authors themselves, as well as editors, would be allowed to sort of evaluate the reviews that they received. I was curious whether you guys think the evaluation of reviews should be restricted to those entities, or do you think they could be brought into the community at large? And how do you think about the right mechanism for who gets to evaluate reviews? How do you keep? How do you think about that from a user sort of experience standpoint as well?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So when it comes to evaluating reviewers, there's also a case to be made that you don't want to necessarily be public about absolutely everything. So the problem that we have in a system where everyone can evaluate everyone else is that it creates a tremendous amounts of social pressure. And sometimes when someone does not, let's say, create a incredibly high quality peer review report, or essentially it's just lacking on details or is factually incorrect, private feedback and the ability to say, hey, these are places you could improve, should not be understated in its importance. I think in general, with crypto and Web3, people tend to put too much emphasis on things like tokens, permissionless systems, and all of that. I think science does have very thick communication channels, and the best way is to employ those FIC communication channels to be able to give feedback and to rate peer reviewers in a way that is also respectful and encouraging to them so that they can learn to become better peer reviewers and not be frustrated out of the system, right? So this is a major risk about reviewing the reviewers, is that you frustrate your reviewers and then they might drop out of the system. So there are different ways you could think about that, and we're very early thinking about those problems. One of the ways you could imagine is create, randomized rating systems in which you ask, the chairs of the ARC to essentially, give sporadic ratings of reviewers, since they are essentially digesting the peer review reports in their entirety, right? So they are the people that essentially have already done, are already familiar with the peer review reports, are well respected in their field, have substantial expertise, and they're probably the best ones to ask when it comes to evaluate how useful this peer review report has been in your evaluation. And I think there's also, there's many angles to this, but these are some of the levels at which we're thinking, which I would like to preface is at a very embryonic level currently.
Yes, totally. And just to clarify, so what I was talking about earlier, this is just one idea. This doesn't mean that this is ultimately what we're going to do, or that this would be the only thing that that our system would enable. I do think that, again, this is one of these areas where we just don't really know very much what works and what doesn't. So my instinct is that there is probably something to be gained by holding reviewers accountable and rewarding them for particularly good work and giving them feedback. But how exactly we do that, this is, again, it's an open question where actual research is needed.
Yeah, and there's also the homunculi problem, right? Who evaluates the person who evaluated the reviewer?
Yep.
So there's a series of embedded homunculi issues in reviewing reviewers. So I'm really curious how you're thinking about this, Darren. If you want to give us a few pointers.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of the have rather than a fully trustless decentralized system. You kind of have to have trust embedded in, whether it's mediated through community members or editors that you already have some trust to sort of seed the kind of review. It's difficult. I think one of the things I talked a little bit about last week as an idea is having sort of retrospective analyses at fixed intervals as a sort of forcing mechanism to kind of evaluate the reviews in a way where perhaps people can kind of come to a consensus, like, have a panel every year or 10 years or whatever to take a look at which of the reviews are actually credible at the time. And in some ways, it's kind of like the retroactive funding mechanisms, where by establishing that structure at the beginning, that is almost a meta incentive for people to want to be cognizant and careful with how they're reviewing things. And so that perhaps is more of almost an a priority quality assurance mechanism for reviews.
Yes, I'm a huge fan of a priori quality mechanism in mechanism design. So yes, I think you want to ideally have a credible system in place that creates an incentive to behave well from the start, right? And I think you want to signal that in a credible way. And if you manage to signal this in a credible way, you might just be able to skirt all the higher technicalities around it, like who evaluates the evaluators of the peer reviewers.
Exactly. But really, really cool stuff. I'd love to keep chatting and exploring ideas on this front, because I think it's a hairy problem to solve. So will require a lot of thinking together.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for joining, by the way.
Yeah, sure thing. It was really cool to see it.
So I know that we're 15 minutes over right now. Does anyone else have any other questions that they'd like to ask before we close out the call?
have a very brief question, and it's also a call to action. Just to remind everyone, there is a Discord server related to DCI Labs if you're listening, and there is a whole bunch of different channels talking about different aspects of science. And there's a peer review channel. And Chris, in there a couple weeks ago, I think, you briefly mentioned the relationship between a peer review and curation and how you're trying to differentiate the two, because we currently live in a system where the same people who peer review also publish the item to the world and say what's good and what's bad. I'm hoping you might be able to speak just a little bit to that.
Yeah, and I think this is something, by the way, that came to me when I was talking to Darren, and Darren proposed it, and he mentioned that perhaps something that would be of great help is decoupling evaluation of soundness with evaluation of impact. Currently, these two things are bundled together in the same workflow process. Of course, there are journals that only evaluate soundness, like PLOS, Frontiers, and these families of journals. But for the great majority of scientific journals or also conference venues, these two things are bundled as one. You could imagine systems in which you solely evaluate the soundness of a particular piece of work, and at a second stage, or perhaps at a certain time interval, let's say every 6 months, every 3 months, every X, you have an event in which the community can use tools such as quadratic voting to essentially curate and order, right? Rank order the research that has been validated by that particular arc in a way that you could have, for example, a type of cutoff that would promote these specific nodes as exemplary work as agreed by the community. And I think here the use of quadratic funding is also, not quadratic funding, quadratic voting is very interesting, because you can then capture the intensity of belief, right? If you only have, let's say, thumbs up, thumbs down, that does not allow you to capture the intensity of preference or the intensity of belief, whereas quadratic voting does allow you. So you could imagine that these communities at these regular time intervals would have a certain budget, right, a QV budget, and they could choose to keep that budget, or they could choose to start spending that budget by curating work, of course, that is not theirs, that they do not have, let's say, conflict of interest with the authors, which is a whole other bag of worm, by the way, to essentially decouple these two functions, right? So the idea is, first stage, it's the evaluation of soundness, evaluation of the objective attributes of these nodes, right? Are they reproducible? Have the code been shared? Are the conclusions supported by the data? All of these more objective evaluation criteria would be performed at the time of the workflow, and at a later stage, you would have a curation process which would be community-wide, so arc-wide, and use mechanisms such as quadratic voting to capture the intensity of belief of their participants.
It's just really interesting, all the stuff you can do with arcs. I love it. I could listen to this stuff all day.
It's great chatting to all of you.
So does anyone else have any additional questions before we close out? All righty. Well, with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. This has been a wonderful discussion. I will be posted on the YouTube channel. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, you can find the link to that playlist in the info channel in our Discord under the welcome category. So feel free to go look for that. Thank you once again to Ian for all of his hard work on the general index and the weekly updates. Thank you to everyone who came. Thank you to Carla for everything she's doing, to John for recording the call, Chris and Philip for coming to speak. And we will be having a community call next week. So feel free to come into the Discord and talk about the things you'd like to hear. And with that, I think we're pretty much done for the day.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. This was really